So, I am currently studying theology, and one of the subjects that I'm busy with is the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books in the Bible. So, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they tell a fascinating story, and that's the one that I'm going to be preaching from today. So, one of the books for the subjects that I'm currently busy with is by a guy called James E. Smith. So if I mention Smith throughout my sermon, that's the man that I'm quoting. So if you're taking notes this morning, my sermon title is The Exodus. And to give you a quick breakdown of the book of Exodus and a little bit further, it begins with the Israelites enslaved in Egypt. A new king, unaware of what Joseph had done, oppresses the Israelites. And then later on, God calls Moses at the burning bush to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Moses and Aaron confront Pharaoh, demanding the release of the Israelites, and God sends 10 plagues on Egypt, which culminates in the death of the firstborn sons. The Israelites, spared by the Passover lamb's blood, leave Egypt guided by a pillar of cloud and of fire, and they miraculously cross the Red Sea while the Egyptian army drowns. God goes on to provide manna, quail, and water in the wilderness. And at Mount Sinai, God gives Moses the law, including the 10 commandments, and he establishes a covenant with the Israelites. After some golden calf drama and intercession from Moses, God promises to accompany the Israelites and gives Moses new stone tablets with the 10 commandments on them. And then the book goes on to end with the tabernacle's erection and the cloud of God's presence covering it. Now, in terms of a timeline, it took the Israelites 3 months from their departure of Egypt to their arrival at Mount Sinai. They ended up staying there for about just over a year, and it's in that time period in which the book of Exodus happens, while part of the book of Exodus, all of Leviticus, and part of Numbers takes place. And then they go on to take an 11-day journey from the mountain to the edge of Canaan. And that's where we pick up the story, a full book and a half later in Numbers 13. In verse 1 to 25, we read how leaders from each of the 12 tribes are sent out to explore the land, and they do so for 40 days, and then they return and give a report to the entire Israelite community. And Numbers 13, verse 27 to 33 is their report. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land. For we can certainly do it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they explored. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. In chapter 14, the Israelites continue to rebel despite Moses, Aaron, Caleb, and Joshua pleading with them. And eventually God has enough and wants to destroy the Israelites. Moses once again pleads on their behalf. And in verse 20 to 23, it says the following. The Lord replied, I have forgiven them as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. All the Israelites who were 20 years and older, except for Caleb and Joshua, never made it into the promised land. But before I get to the reason for why they never made it into the promised land, perhaps you're wondering why the sermon is titled The Exodus when we're reading a book and a half later in Numbers? It's because it is all one story. The claiming of the promised land begins by the Exodus. But all those Israelites never made it to the promised land because they forgot point number one. Remembrance receives redemption. What did the Israelites need to remember? The laws they were given? Yes. The ceremonies they were supposed to follow? Yes. But there was one other thing that they needed to remember to help get them into the promised land, and that is the Exodus. Exodus 29 verse 45 to 46 says, "Then I will dwell among the Israelites and be their God. They will know that I am the Lord their God who brought them out of Egypt so that I may dwell among them. I am the Lord their God." The Israelites had forgotten what God had brought them out of. The Israelites had forgotten the mighty hand that had delivered them. See, God brings us out of captivity so that He may dwell among us. But by the time we reach Numbers 14, the Israelites propose returning to Egypt. Smith mentions how they were rejecting God's entire plan of redemption. And as I said, from Exodus 1 to the mission of the spies is one plot. See how Israel was brought out of Egypt to the borders of Canaan. It is one story. And Smith goes on to highlight that with their goal within their sights, they suggest giving it all up. See, the Israelites could only remember the good food that they'd eaten in Egypt. They could remember the cucumbers, the leeks, the melons, the onions. They seemed to forget the oppression that they for so long had to endure under the leadership of the Egyptian Pharaoh. See, God wanted them to remember the Exodus. He wanted them to remember the plagues. He wanted them to remember the fact that He parted an entire sea and they walked through on dry ground. And you look at the Israelites and you want to say to them, "Hey, lungisani ukuqinaqelu." Kwenu, I said that incorrectly, which means fix your thinking. Or like the Afrikaans people say, kom reg. But it's easy to tell someone what to do when you're watching from afar, or when you know the outcome of the story. On the rare occasion that my wife and I get to watch a movie, my wife decides and likes to read the synopsis of the movie before she actually watches the movie because she doesn't like surprises. But then all throughout the movie, she has to fight wanting to tell the person not to go there because she knows exactly what is coming for them. Thankfully, she does all of that fighting in her head because I like to find out what happens in a movie when it happens. But there is one type of person, and I can say this because I am part of this group, that when it comes to telling someone what they should be doing and how they would have done it better, they take the cake. And that is an Afrikaans man watching a rugby match. See, if I could go back to the Israelites, I would tell them, I know you came from Egypt and God provided for you there, and He provided for you in the wilderness with manna, water, and quail, but He has milk and honey for you. And they would respond, but there are giants there. How will we defeat them? And to that I would respond, who sent the plagues? God did. Who parted the sea? God did. Who provided your every meal for over a year? God did. And who do you think created those giants that you so fear? God did. They forgot. And if they had remembered what God has done, His plan of redemption for them would have been carried out right there and then, instead of 39 years later. They were forgetful. And the one thing you need to believe and know is that if you're not going to claim a promise that God has for you, He is going to give it to somebody else. because it was meant for those who left Egypt and their children, but it was only given to their children. Moses and the other guys tried to tell Israel, you are out of Egypt, now stay there. But they wouldn't have it. But how often do we conduct ourselves the exact same way that the Israelites do? We receive a promise from God, we receive deliverance from our captivity, and then we spit in God's face by wanting to go back to the thing we prayed for deliverance from. And you don't need to think that I'm over-exaggerating, because I'm not. God was willing and ready to destroy them because of their rebellion. They spat in God's face. They rejected his plan for redemption because they didn't remember. But you see, the thing is that if God could coordinate that a man rejected by his brothers would be sold as a slave, travel all the way from Egypt to be selected to work in the most powerful man's home, be put into prison, be raised to power, rescue all of Egypt and Israel, release the Israelites through 10 plagues, the parting of an entire sea, bringing of manna and water from a rock, then he could certainly deliver them to the promise that he had given them. But they were forgetful. Last week, during the holidays, my son John was sick. And obviously, as your children do, they decide to get sick on the most frustrating and busiest times of your life. Not frustrating, just busy. But I was tasked with going to fetch soup that my mother-in-law had made for my son. So I get to the house, and my brother-in-law is praying outside. He's playing some cricket. And I quickly send him into the house to go and fetch the soup for me. And it takes a while, and about 5 minutes later, he comes back to me, and he says he cannot find the soup. So I get out of the car, I go into the house, I open the fridge, and immediately I spot the soup. Now, when I show you the photo, I'm sure that many of you are going to be able to recognize the soup as well. You guys can put that up on the screen for me. I then went on to give him an important life lesson, and that is the fact that botterbakkies are not always botterbakkies. But I only gave him part of the lesson, because the part that I left out is the fact that ice cream buckets do not always contain ice cream in them. But I tell you that story for a reason, because if we go back to Exodus, just because the process of receiving the promise isn't packaged and presented the way you thought it would be, doesn't mean that it's not there. Moses said the following, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance of the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still." Exodus 14, verse 13 to 14. You see, the fact is that if God has called you to it, he will get you through it. So firstly, remembrance receives redemption. Secondly, covenant contains a calling. When we look at Deuteronomy, we see that God renewed his covenant with the Israelites. He entered into covenant with them, and in doing so, they were called to conduct themselves and act in a certain manner. The same applies for us. Covenant contains a calling. Part of the covenant of Israel included a call to action. See, God had promised them the land, but that meant that they would need to take action to receive that promise. The land had already been given to Israel, but the land still had to be conquered by them. Some of you have been given a promise by God. You've been given a promise, and this is how you go on to wait and receive that promise. You sit there, and you expect the promise to fall into your lap. But that's not how it works. Some of you, perhaps, are not only just sitting and waiting for a promise. Some of you are like Israel, and you're returning to Egypt. Because you think, oh no, it can't be for me. Oh no, I'm not good enough. Oh no, they're too big. Or oh no, we're too few. But let me give you a few news headlines for your life. You aren't good enough. The enemy is too big. The devil is stronger than you. But that's the point. See, you need to rely on the one who is good enough, the one who is big enough, and the one who is stronger than the devil. Because then all you can say is that God did it, and you can't take any of the glory for yourself. Paul said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. For when I am weak, then I am strong. But we're too prideful to do that. So many of us decide to rather turn from the promise that God has given us and head back to Egypt. But I have one more news headline for you. God isn't there. He's not waiting for you in Egypt. Smith says, your future is determined by your present walk. Obedient faith leads to blessing, but disobedience to disaster. You get to decide. Do you want to be in covenant with God and live out the call that He has for you? Or do you want to head back to Egypt and allow your life to spiral out into a disobedient disaster? Maybe you're already there. Maybe you have been wandering in the desert for many years. But I have one more truth for you. There is still hope for you. So often the God of the Old Testament has been labeled as the God of wrath and destruction, and the God of the New Testament in Jesus is the one who's labeled as the one of mercy and love. But time and time again in the Old Testament, we see God have mercy on His people. Sometimes the consequences are severe, but God always finds a way to return into relationship with His people, and He wants to do the same for you today. Jesus died on a cross so that you could have access to the throne room of grace, so that you could personally ask for forgiveness, for God to forgive your sins and once again lead you into the promises that He has for you.